Hi everyone, I'm Mace from Rumsey. In this video I'm going to show you how the compactor control logics can store the firmware and all the parameters for a peripheral that it's taken ownership of. In this case we're going to show a PowerFlex 525, how it can have the ownership of all the parameters but also the firmware. In an event the drive fails, you could actually have a quick replacement of that drive. So first you want to make sure that your project is fully completed. As you can see, I am online with the controller, and at the bottom, if I select the drive, you can see that the status is running and the IO OK button, LED indicator, is green illuminated. So first, to be able to store the firmware and the configuration in the SD card in the Compact Logics, we need to go into the program mode out of run mode. So I'll do that. Then I'll navigate to where the properties are for the controller itself. I'll go to non-volatile memory. Load store is where all the information is, and when they say non-volatile memory, that is specifically talking about the SD card that's in the Compact Logics in this case. Load image, when it says user initiated, that means if in normal operation you would run it in user initiated. The other conditions, if you wanted to always have the parameters and the firmware booted into the system on power up, you could do that as well. But in our case we're just going to stay with the user initiated. At the bottom is what we're really pertaining to in this video. Automatic firmware update. If you select that to enable, as I'm doing now, and then you need to hit store, just say yes for the continue the store. Then you'll get one final confirmation, and this is important to take note of. This is listing the products that will not store the firmware. And if you notice, the PowerFlex 525 drive is not listed, so therefore it will store into the controller and into the Compact Logics and able to match into the drive. One thing to point out here is before all of this, and as you'll see from the write-up that's included with this video, you have to have the firmware, as far as today is concerned, it's called Control Flash, but that is going to change soon for some of you informed people in the readings, that Control Flash is for the drive and the controllers. It's the utility that puts the firmware in any of those devices. You have to have the correct matching version for the drive and for the controller. So in this case I have firmware 30 for the controller and firmware 4.001 for the drive. I'm going to soon simulate where we'll have a new drive simulated as firmware 5 that the controller will actually down sync it and rev it to 4 to do an exact match. So I'll hit yes, and you'll see on the controller it's normal to see some unusual activity, and you'll even see a red light at the end that makes the controller go offline for a temporary. So you definitely want to make sure that if the system's operational that you pick an offline time to do all this setup. The cool part is you only have to do it once and it will be stored into that SD card permanently. So as you can see, the controller went to red. Now we'll pause the video for a few minutes while it comes back up. Okay, so now the controller returned to the normal state. As you can see, we have green lights as we'd expect. If we go back online, we'll just correlate the project. And now you can see we're online and where everything's good. Now one thing to point out, another stage of the ADC setup, is go to the profile of the drive itself. So I'm going to double click on it. And I'm making some assumptions here that you have all this set up and have previous training to set up a drive in Logic's Designer, okay? But the default, some of you might notice, is the electronic keying is compatible module. To make ADC work, it has to be exact match. That's how the controller knows if the firmware is different and if the parameters are different. Now, one thing I get often asked about, this is, as you noticed, a manual saving process. It doesn't take that long, but it is manually saved. So if you make any changes after you've saved to the SD card, you need to resave them again. That's important. Okay, so after a few minutes, when the SD card has been written to, you'll find that your green lights appear back as you'd expect normally. If you place the processor back into run, now you should be able to start your drive as normal. Most of our drives by default will go into a fault mode, so we have to clear the fault. My particular code, I need to hit stop and then start, and now we can run the drive. Okay. And that is, by the way, the default setting. You don't always have to fault the drive if you lose communications from the controller, but it is a safety issue sometimes, so it's a good idea to do that. And why that happened is because the controller went into a reboot, so it lost ownership of the drive momentarily. Okay. So again, we talked about the add-on profile. Let's go take a quick look to make sure that the drive is matched to the firmware that's loaded in there. So if I hit change on the profile, you'll see why I changed electron keying from the default, which is normally compatible module, to exact match. That's what makes sure that the controller is always checking the firmware in the drive. And soon you're going to see how the controller is going to notice the firmware changed, and then we'll let the controller change it back to what it was saved in the SD card. So let's do that. I'll hit cancel again. Now I'm going to just take the controller's Ethernet cable and unplug it from the drive so I can program the drive independently and put a higher firmware which would simulate a new drive. All right? So let's do that. As you can see, the controller notices the drive's been unplugged and gives that yellow exclamation point in the project. I'm going to minimize Studio 5000 for now. I'm going to go to Control Flash. I actually have a speed button down in the taskbar here, but you could also, of course, keep it where it is originally installed under Flash Programming Tools and Control Flash. This is the same control flash that Rockwell has used for many years to load firmware into their devices, not just drives, not just controllers. So I'm going to hit next. I'm going to select the drive that this is. Now this particular one is just the standard 525 with the built-in single Ethernet port and the DSI serial. Hit next again. Now navigate to the drive through Ethernet, highlight the drive, say OK. And now I'm going to put firmware 5 in, and if you may recall, the controller's SD card is stored 4. So this will give us a simulation of a new drive. So I'm going to proceed with that. As soon as I hit finish, it's going to put firmware 5 into the drive after you say yes. Okay, so now our drive has finished updating the firmware to 5, simulating potentially a new drive that would be of a different firmware than the controller was originally taking care of, or owning is the correct word. So I'm going to cancel the control flash, go back to Logic Designer to demonstrate the status. So let's look at the status while we're online with the controller for the drive. If I highlight it, as we saw before, the yellow exclamation point appears, and at the bottom it says I/O fault and module fault. That just simply means the controller can't communicate with it because I unplugged the controller from the drive. So now we're going to watch this little status as I plug the drive back in. Because the IP address is already preset, and that's one thing to briefly go over, you can have a static switch assign the IP address automatically. So all the person would have to do is power up the drive, plug in the Ethernet cable, and per port, the Stratix switch can assign the IP address correctly for whatever drive is plugged into it, or any other devices. This also goes for IC sensors. Many other devices can be assigned IP addresses if they're Ethernet, of course, right? So the IP address in this case, though, was preset, so I didn't go through that, but I hope you can follow that. If not, please call any of us for any questions on that. So again, with the IP address remaining the same, the controller will recognize it at that point. I'm going to plug the Ethernet drive back into the controller. And as soon as that's plugged in, you'll find that the drive will find it. And if you notice on the lower left, it states firmware updating. That's because it noticed that it's at 5 and the controller has the firmware 4 that's saved in the SD card. So this is automatically recognizing that the drive has to go to the match the SD card. So this is great for validated systems. If any of you out there have validated systems that are inspected per firmware revisions, you can actually have the I/O, as you saw earlier, where it had I/O listed that was not included in this particular demonstration. You could include that to match the firmware for I/O modules as well. So this will take just a few minutes, and if you notice on the drive itself, it says flashing, and we'll pause the video for a few minutes until it's finished flashing. Okay, so now you can see firmware has been completed, and you see the word configuring. Now, just the simple configuration of all the parameters, and by the way, there are many parameters. There's probably 60 or 70 parameters that are stored on the SD card that the controller takes ownership of. Now it's loading those, and in a moment you'll see where that just goes back to running, which is full operational status. Okay, so now you can see where it went from configuring to the running status. The drive is ready to start. And I can just come over here, ensure things are reset, and start the drive as we were before. So that is basically the complete from a drive replacement automatic device configuration feature. People like to say drive very often because drives are probably the most commonly used. But as you can see, it can be used with any product out there. Okay, so that wraps up the automatic device configuration procedure. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call myself, Mace Bittman at Rumsey, or any of the ASG or Automation Solution Group personnel. Thank you for your time.